Now, the 2 sessions, we will be dealing with ecology. The first session, we're going to be looking at some general overviews of population dynamics. And on the second part, we will be looking a little bit more on ecological relationships. Now, in community interactions, which is basically interactions between organisms, between species, and sometimes between populations and the environment, there are a few terms that we need to understand: habitat and niche. Habitat is the physical environment that an organism lives in. A niche is referred to in ecology as the resources that a given organism has to have to survive. So thus, an organism lives in a given place, which is the habitat, but it utilizes a number of vital resources, which we refer to as the niche. Secondly, we will look at ecological dominant and keystone species. Ecological dominant species basically overwhelm competition. Keystone species exert undue influence in a given ecological system. In a given ecological system, biodiversity is important, and we will be looking at 3 types. And finally, we're going to look at the types of interactions that occur in an ecosystem: competition, predation, parasitism, and different types of symbiosis. In this slide, we're looking at 2 ecosystems. It is obvious that in both ecosystems, we have a dominant species. To your left, we see trees. To the right, we see grasses. And you will find in many ecosystems a dominant species occupying a given landscape. These starfish occupy a disproportionate influence in the food chain. If you eliminate these starfish in this particular ecosystem, the complete ecosystem will completely fall apart. Biodiversity is extremely important in all ecosystems. We can look at species diversity, geographic diversity, and genetic diversity. Obviously, a high biodiversity in each of these categories is beneficial to the ecosystem. Let's look at competition that exists within an ecosystem. Here we're looking at the kudzu vine in Mississippi. And you can see the kudzu vine is quite successful. It is completely overwhelming the ecosystem as we're looking at here. The kudzu system is occupying a given habitat, and it is utilizing, of course, the resources, the niche, in that particular ecosystem. But for the kudzu is competing with all the other flora that exist in this particular ecosystem. The kudzu is basically outcompeting everybody. Now, when an organism outcompetes everybody, when an organism requires all of the resources in that particular area, we refer to that particular scenario as competitive exclusion. Basically, 2 species cannot occupy the same niche. If the kudzu plant requires all of the resources in this particular area, then the kudzu plant will either survive or will not survive, and no one else is going to compete. This is referred to as the competitive exclusion principle. Now, sometimes in competition, there are compromises. In this case, we have several birds that require certain resources, certain niche to survive. And what they're doing over here is that these 3 birds have evolved into 3 little species. Each will occupy a certain part of this broader niche. The Cape May warble occupies the top, the bay-breasted warble occupies the middle, and the myrtle warble occupies pretty much towards the bottom. This is referred to as resource partitioning, and sometimes evolution simply moves in this direction. All of us are familiar with predator-prey relationships. In nature, this is just part of the dynamics of life. We have all watched our cats go out and, without mercy, eat anything that comes around. Now, the cat is perfectly happy. The mouse, of course, is not happy. Let's look at the dynamics of predator-prey relationships. Now, if we look at the predator, the wolf, and the prey, the moose, if we look at their population numbers over a number of years, we can see that whenever the wolf population is low, the moose population is high. Wherever the moose population is low, the wolf population is high. And of course, this basically illustrates this predator-prey relationship in that wherever there's a lot of food to be eaten, the food will certainly be consumed by the predator, and the moose, which is the food, of course, will drop as the population of the wolves go up. This is an interesting predator-prey relation. This fish is actually fishing. If you look carefully, this fish has evolved with a lure, and when another fish comes by to grab the little wiggly worm you see on the top, this fish will pounce on him and devour the would-be predator. So the predator and the prey get really confused here. Now, let's look at some defense mechanisms in predator-prey relationships. Many of these obvious: camouflage, mimicry, external protection, armor, poisons, bad taste. All of us are familiar with the bad taste that we've seen when a dog is trying to eat a frog. Recently, my dog almost died from eating a frog that tasted bad. Group support strategy, speed, shelter, and so on. So the predator-prey relationships are very dynamic. Over the centuries, defense mechanisms evolve on a continuous basis. Let's look at some of these defense mechanisms. Here we're looking at camouflage. As you can see to the left, there's a worm that's hooked to a twig. I can hardly see the worm. To the right, you can easily see, or maybe you cannot see, the chameleon. The chameleon, of course, can change its color and blend in very nicely into the environment. Camouflage is a very important defense mechanism in nature. This is mimicry. This is really an interesting defense mechanism. On the top, we have a bad-tasting butterfly, and everyone in the neighborhood knows that this butterfly tastes bad. To the bottom, we have a moth that over the centuries had evolved to look like the butterfly, even though this moth tastes pretty good. Because it looks so much like the butterfly, all of the critters in the neighborhood are leaving it alone. And this is an interesting one. Look at the bee to the left and the moth to the right. The bee has a sting, and of course, everyone in the neighborhood avoids the bee. So what does the moth do? The moth develops the coloration, the body structure, and perhaps some other habits that will mimic the bee. Now the moth, even though the moth has no sting and cannot fight off predators, the moth is mistaken for the bee, and the moth now has taken on the defense characteristics of the bee. In a parasitic relationship, of course, one organism will take advantage of another organism. In this case right here, we see this parasitic vine basically choking off this green plant. Now, the parasitic vine does not have the chloroplast for making sugar. So instead, the vine basically utilizes the food that's being produced by the other green plant. Now, I like these relationships. Mutualism. Everybody's happy here. We're looking at the rhinoceros and the oxpecker bird. All of you have seen this. You see the rhino walking around, or you may see the hippopotamus and other birds. Now, the rhino is hanging around there. It is being infested by little worms and parasites, and the birds are sitting there taking advantage of the opportunity and basically cleaning the skin and the cracks and crevices that are occupied by these parasites. To the right, we see an interesting relationship between the shrimp goby and the snapping shrimp. One is very large, one is very small, and the two kind of hang around together. One has a certain role, and the other one has a more of a protective role, and the two get along together. If you think about it, mutualism might be mutualism is a good example of how humans and dogs relate to each other. One benefits from the other. Now let's look at another factor in the ecology, ecological succession, which is basically rebounding from adversity. We're looking at Mount St. Helena that blew up back in the 80s, and you can see at the bottom what has happened to the ecosystem over the years. Obviously, ecosystem will rebound from virtually any adversity. Ecological succession is basically the process of how organisms respond to adversity. Now, this adversity may be natural or man-made. The response may be a primary succession, which is a response when an ecological system is completely wiped out. Or it may be secondary succession, where the ecological system is partially destroyed by way of forest fire, flood, and so on. The eventual outcome of any ecological succession is to reach a climax community. Let's look at an ecological system and trace the process of succession. Primary succession process. Let's say that to your left we have a disaster that completely wipes out all of the flora and fauna, which is all living things. Land is exposed. The land has virtually no soil. What happens next? What happens next is pioneer species come in. These species may be lichens, bacteria, liverworts, horsetails, whatever. But these organisms are able to survive with minimal soil. In fact, what lichens do is they can attach themselves to a bare rock, produce the right type of chemicals that pulverize the rock and are able to carry out photosynthesis and provide a base for themselves. Now, once this pioneer species adapt themselves to a given environment, next come shrubs. The shrubs can take advantage of the new soil that has been produced by the lichens and bacteria. And once shrubs establish themselves, brush come in, and as you can see, the process continues until you reach a climax community, which is basically a community that is balanced and full of the vegetation and living organisms that you expect in that particular environment.